Depending on where you stand in terms of topic development, there are two different scenarios you can follow when locating and categorizing sources. If you have a topic, but no narrowly focused research question, you can use sources to help refine that question. Many of you are probably at this stage. If I suggested that your topic was too broad in the annotated bibliography, the best way to narrow it is through the research from the sources themselves. The second scenario applies if you've already selected a narrow research question. You can use the sources to help you find the answer to your research question and to guide the development and execution of your primary research project. Even if you still don't have a refined topic, you'll go through this process eventually. When you transition from exploration to serious research, you are faced with two significant problems. Just by nature, when we are researching, we quickly embrace content that we agree with, but sometimes miss content that contradicts our previously held beliefs. This is how blind spots happen in research. I've asked you to locate these blind spots in the secondary sources themselves, but be aware of your own blind spots too. Ideally, you will approach all of your secondary research objectively, regardless of where you stand personally. This will also help ensure that your primary research doesn't have similar flaws. Also, frankly, it's a chore to take good notes that can be useful later on. But you'll find that if you keep track of your sources now, you'll thank yourself later on. You don't want to be in a blind panic searching for a quotation from an earlier source as you're putting the finishing touches on your prospectus. It's a bit hard to talk about evidence in Writing 250, just because the value of evidence and the way it comes about varies between fields. But one of the goals of this course is for you to be able to figure out what that definition is for your own field by engaging in the research process. Part of becoming an effective researcher in your field is understanding the kinds of evidence your readers expect. If you've been reading along in the craft of research, which I hope you have been, you'll see this in the larger theme of the book. Research is all about matching your purpose with the expectations of your audience. There are several types of evidence, though. Each one has value, but the extent of that value varies by field. Personal beliefs, for example, have very limited value to particle physicists or geological engineers, but may be critical to social work researchers or anthropologists. Direct quotations from individual accounts have value for everyone, but the extent such accounts are possible depends on the field. A particle physicist, for example, cannot give a direct quotation from a proton. The point is, be aware of the different types of evidence, and be able to identify the type of evidence that a secondary source is using. Not only does this give you a heuristic for organizing your sources, but it can provide an essential foundation for evaluating them. Make sure you are keeping track of your sources along the way. I can't emphasize this enough. I've seen plenty of Writing 250 papers where the references page doesn't match the actual content of the submission. You don't want that to be you. Take a look at the list on page 86 of our textbook if you are recording information by hand. There are a few strategies that will help you take note of your source material quickly. If you are recording information digitally using OneSearch or RefWorks, there are lots of ways to keep track of all of your information in a logical, organized way. Part of writing a literature review involves categorizing secondary sources. Here are some common categories you might come up with for secondary sources. Keep in mind that your sources don't have to be all or nothing in terms of their value. Many of you noted in your annotated bibliography that a particular source probably wasn't useful in its entirety for your project. Don't throw it away just yet. Make sure there aren't any minor parts of the source that could be useful to you. Is the method of research useful? What about the way the researchers collected their data? All of this is fair game for secondary research. Once you have developed categories for your sources, you should use journalistic questions to evaluate them. There's a lot more to evaluating sources than just these, of course, but if you answer the who, what, where, when, why, and how of a source completely, you'll have tons of raw material for your synthesis. First, who? Who is the author of the source? What are the author's credentials? In the exploratory essay, you had to distinguish between popular sources and academic sources. What were some things that made the academic researchers more credible? Also, who is the intended audience of the source? You had to answer this one in each rhetorical précis you put together. Finally, who is the publisher of the source? Are they credible and reputable? What about their blind spots in terms of research they publish? The second journalistic question you should ask is what? What is the overall purpose of this publication? If it's a non-academic source, is its purpose to sell, to entertain? If you're sure the source is academic in nature, this is a much easier question to answer. You also want to ask yourself what biases or points of view the source implies, and whether or not the source is based on original, primary research. Finally, ask yourself what the reasons, evidence, and assumptions are for the text. For the question where, ask yourself where the source came from. Did it come from a library database or from Google search? What does the origin of the source tell you about its credibility? Where does the source link to? Does it cite to other sources? Is there any indication that other researchers cite the source? The location of the source will tell you a lot about its validity as current academic research. When is an easy question to answer. When was the source published, and when was it updated, if at all? The currency of a source is essential, and it has an impact on the answers to a lot of your other questions. If you are using a dated source, you should be able to articulate a very compelling reason for using it. The last two questions are harder and more abstract. The first is why. Why should you use this source? Why is it better than other similar sources? Why is the information in this source directly related to your original research project? This question requires you to articulate a defense. You can't just say that you are using a source because it was the first one to show up. Finally, how? How does the selection of evidence in the source reflect the interest and expertise of the author? What is the relationship there? How would you use this source in your own research project? How would you use it to support your thesis? How compelling is the source's evidence for your readers? If you ask yourself these questions about each one of your sources, you should have a lot of good material to work into your literature review.